June 25th, 1906, Madison Square Garden, a rooftop theater, warm night, electric lights strung above the audience. Stanford White sits in the crowd watching a musical revue called Mamselle Champagne. He is 52 years old, one of the most celebrated architects in America, designer of the building he now sits inside. Harry Kendall Thaw enters the theater late, walks slowly down the aisle, and stops beside White's seat. He removes a pistol from his coat. He fires 3 times into White's face at point-blank range. White's body slumps forward. The orchestra stops. Women scream. Thaw raises the gun above his head, holds it there for a moment, then turns toward the exit. He says calmly, to no one in particular, "He ruined my wife." This is not a story about justice, passion, or madness in the way the newspapers would describe it. This is a story about a man born into one of the largest fortunes in America who spent his entire life trying to control what he could not understand and destroying what he could not control. Harry Kendall Thaw inherited railroads, coal mines, and coke ovens. He inherited servants, estates, and silence. What he did not inherit was the ability to live with himself. Wealth gave him access to everything except peace. It paid for his violence, his obsessions, and his escapes. It could not make him sane. It could not make him loved. And in the end, it could not even make him remember. Harry Kendall Thaw was born in Pittsburgh on February 12, 1871, into a family that owned the infrastructure of industrial America. His father, William Thaw, had built an empire on coal and railroads. The Pennsylvania Railroad, the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie, investments in steel and coke that fed the furnaces of the Gilded Age. When William died in 1889, he left behind an estate worth $40 million. Harry was 18 years old. He would never work a day in his life. The Thaw family lived on a hilltop estate in Allegheny, overlooking the smoke and foundries of Pittsburgh below. The house was large, cold, and silent. Harry's mother, Mary Copley Thaw, ruled it with the discipline of a woman who believed wealth was a responsibility, not a pleasure. She was devoutly Presbyterian, rigidly moral, and suspicious of affection. She raised her children to understand that their fortune came with expectations, propriety, restraint, and the invisible labor of maintaining the family name. Harry was the youngest of 6 children, and from early childhood he understood that he would inherit money, but not purpose. His older brothers were groomed for business, for managing the estate, for continuing what their father had built. Harry was not. He was erratic, temperamental, quick to anger. As a boy, he tortured animals, small cruelties that servants whispered about but did not report. He had tantrums that lasted hours. He broke things. His mother tried discipline, then distance. She sent him to private tutors, then to boarding schools. None of it worked. By the time he was a teenager, Harry had been expelled from multiple institutions. The reasons varied: fights with other students, violent outbursts, refusal to follow rules. His mother paid for the silence of headmasters, for fresh starts at new schools, for the quiet removal of her son from places where his behavior had become unbearable. Wealth in the Thaw family was not just money. It was insulation. It was the ability to make problems disappear, to relocate a troubled son without consequence, to ensure that no scandal reached the newspapers. Harry learned early that his actions had no permanent cost. He could break things, hurt people, fail again and again, and the world would simply reset itself around him. His mother's money was a kind of erasure. It removed evidence, smoothed over damage, and kept moving forward as if nothing had happened. In 1889, when his father died, Harry inherited a share of the fortune that made him independently wealthy for life. He was 18. He had no education, no trade, no discipline. What he had was access to private rail cars, to European hotels, to lawyers and fixers who could make anything go away. His older brother Edward managed the family's business interests. His mother continued to control the estate and the family's public image. Harry was given an allowance, a vast, inexhaustible allowance, and the implicit understanding that he should go somewhere else. He went to Harvard. He lasted 1 semester. He was not expelled for academic failure. He simply stopped attending. No one forced him to return. He moved to New York, rented rooms at the Knickerbocker Hotel, and began spending money the way other men spent time. He bought clothes, horses, and dinners for strangers. He attended the theater, gambled at private clubs, and surrounded himself with people who existed only because he paid them to. He had no friends, only employees. No one challenged him. No one said no. By his early 20s, Harry had developed a reputation among a certain class of New Yorkers, the idle sons of industrialists, the men who lived off inherited fortunes and filled their days with excess because there was nothing else to fill them with. But even within that world, Harry stood out. He was not charming. He did not have the easy confidence of other wealthy young men. He was paranoid, obsessive, and volatile. He believed people were watching him, mocking him, conspiring against him. He would fixate on perceived slights, an offhand comment, a glance from across a room, and nurse them into grievances that lasted for months. His mother worried, but distantly. She wrote letters urging him to return to Pittsburgh, to settle down, to marry a woman from an appropriate family. Harry ignored her. He had no interest in the life she imagined for him. What he wanted was not clear, not to his family, and not to himself. He wanted something that money could not name. He wanted to matter. He wanted to be feared or respected or simply seen. But wealth had given him the opposite. It had made him invisible. He could do anything, and nothing he did would ever be remembered. In 1893, Harry left for Europe. He told his mother he was going to study art and culture. He stayed for 2 years. What he actually did was gamble, drink, and pay women to accompany him to parties where no one knew his name. He moved through Paris, Monte Carlo, and London like a ghost. He spent money constantly, compulsively, as if the act of spending could fill the space where a life should have been. He hosted elaborate dinners in rented villas, hired orchestras for private performances, bought jewelry for women he barely spoke to. The excess was not joyful. It was mechanical, exhausting, and profoundly lonely. He rented an apartment in Paris on the Rue de la Paix and spent his days in cafes, watching people, drinking absinthe until late afternoon. He frequented the Moulin Rouge and other music halls, not for pleasure, but as if he were searching for something he couldn't articulate. He threw parties that ended in arguments. He accused acquaintances of stealing from him, of lying to him, of laughing at him behind his back. Some of these accusations were baseless. Others were true. It didn't matter. He cycled through companions quickly. People tolerated him only as long as the money flowed, and it always did. When he returned to New York in 1895, he was 24 years old. He had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars. He had learned nothing. He moved back into the Knickerbocker, resumed his old routines, and waited for something, anything to give his life a shape. His mother continued to send money. His brother continued to manage the family's wealth. Harry continued to exist in the strange, weightless space that wealth had created for him, a life without consequence, without meaning, and without end. He spent his days at the theater, often alone. He watched performers from the same seat night after night, studying them with an intensity that made stagehands uncomfortable. He sent flowers backstage, unsigned. He left tips that were far too large. He was always watching, always waiting, always searching for something that would make him feel real. The money kept coming. The days kept passing. Nothing changed. He did not know it yet, but he was waiting for Evelyn Nesbit. The first time Harry Kendall Thaw was sent away from home, he was 11 years old. The school was a private academy in western Pennsylvania, a place where the sons of wealthy families were taught Latin, mathematics, and the manners required for their station. Harry lasted 3 months. The headmaster wrote to Mary Copley Thaw in careful diplomatic language. Her son had difficulty with authority. He had struck another boy during a dispute over a game. He had been found in the stables, alone, doing something to one of the horses that the stable hand would not describe in detail. The headmaster suggested politely that Harry might benefit from individual tutoring at home. Mary paid the headmaster double his usual fee and enrolled Harry at another institution the following semester. This one was in New England, farther from Pittsburgh, farther from the family name. The pattern repeated. Harry fought with classmates. He refused to attend chapel. He was discovered one evening in the dormitory, standing over a younger boy's bed with a fireplace poker in his hand. He said later that he had only been trying to wake the boy up. The school asked the Thaw family to remove him immediately. There were 4 schools in total before Harry turned 16. Each dismissal was handled quietly. Mary Thaw's lawyers ensured that no records were kept, no letters of reference written that might follow her son into adulthood. The headmasters accepted generous donations to their institutions in exchange for silence. Harry moved from place to place, leaving behind rumors that dissolved as soon as the money arrived. He learned that consequences were temporary. Shame could be purchased away. The world would always make room for him as long as his mother kept paying. At home in Pittsburgh, Harry spent his time alone. He had no close relationships with his siblings. His older brothers, Edward and Josiah, were absorbed in the family business, learning to manage railroads and investments. His sisters were occupied with the social obligations of unmarried women in their class, charity events, music lessons, carefully supervised courtships. Harry existed on the periphery of the family, present at dinners but rarely spoken to, included in family photographs but positioned at the edge of the frame. He developed obsessions that came and went without logic. For several months, he became fixated on collecting insects. He pinned them to boards in his room, hundreds of them, arranged by size and color. Then, abruptly, he lost interest and smashed the boards against the wall, grinding the insects into fragments on the carpet. Another time, he became convinced that one of the household servants was stealing from him. He accused the man repeatedly, searched his quarters, and demanded that his mother dismiss him. No evidence of theft was ever found. The servant was let go anyway. It was easier than listening to Harry's complaints. His mother tried, in her own rigid way, to shape him into something manageable. She hired private tutors who came to the house and attempted to teach him history, literature, science. Harry would sit through lessons for a few days, then refuse to continue. He complained that the tutors were condescending, that they didn't understand him, that they were trying to humiliate him. Mary replaced them. The new tutors lasted no longer than the old ones. Eventually, she stopped hiring them altogether. When William Thaw died in 1889, the family gathered for the funeral at the estate. Harry was 18. He stood with his brothers and sisters in the front pew of the Presbyterian church, dressed in black, his face blank. He did not cry. He showed no visible emotion. After the service, during the reception at the house, he disappeared for several hours. A servant found him later in the stables, sitting on the floor, staring at nothing. He had not attended the burial. The reading of the will took place a week later in the library of the family home. William Thaw had divided his fortune carefully. Edward, as the eldest son, received control of the business interests. Josiah received shares in the railroad. The daughters received trust funds that would provide income for life but could not be spent recklessly. Harry received money, an enormous sum placed in a trust that would pay him an annual allowance of $80,000. It was more than most men earned in a lifetime. It would be his every year, automatically, whether he did anything or not. Mary had insisted on the trust structure. She knew her youngest son. She knew that if he were given the full inheritance at once, he would destroy himself with it. The trust was a compromise between her fear of what he might do and her obligation to provide for him. Harry did not protest the arrangement. He understood on some level that his mother did not believe he could be trusted. He also understood that $80,000 a year was enough to do whatever he wanted. He left Pittsburgh 2 months after the funeral. He told his mother he was going to Cambridge to enroll at Harvard. She gave him her blessing, relieved to see him pursuing something that resembled a future. He arrived in Cambridge in the fall of 1889 and rented rooms near the university. He attended a handful of classes. He sat in lecture halls, surrounded by other young men who took notes and asked questions, and he felt the familiar sensation of being watched, judged, and found lacking. He stopped going after 3 weeks. He did not return to Pittsburgh. He did not tell his mother he had quit. He stayed in Cambridge for the rest of the semester, spending his days in his rooms or walking alone through the city. He ate meals in hotel dining rooms, always at a table by himself. He went to the theater and sat in the back row, watching the stage with a focus that made the ushers uneasy. He wrote long, rambling letters to his mother that described a life he was not living, lectures he attended, professors he admired, friends he had made. She believed him, or pretended to. In the spring, he moved to New York. He was 19 years old. He had failed at school, failed at discipline, failed at every structure his family had tried to impose. But he had money, and money had made all of it irrelevant. He checked into the Knickerbocker Hotel and began the life he would live for the next decade. Aimless, angry, and entirely without constraint. He bought expensive suits and wore them once. He hired carriages to take him to the theater and left before the performance ended. He gambled at private clubs and lost thousands of dollars in single nights without changing expression. He paid for the company of women who smiled at him and left as soon as he fell asleep. He threw parties in his hotel suite that no one enjoyed, including him. He drank until he couldn't stand, then woke the next afternoon and started again. The money kept coming. His mother sent letters asking when he would come home. He did not answer. His brother Edward wrote occasionally, asking if he needed anything, if there was something the family could do. Harry replied with requests for more money, which Edward approved without question. The trust had been designed to protect Harry from himself, but it had done the opposite. It had given him just enough to be dangerous, and not enough to be stopped. In the summer of 1901, Harry Kendall Thaw left New York and boarded a steamship bound for Liverpool. He was 30 years old. He had spent the previous decade moving between hotels, theaters, and private clubs, filling his days with routines that resembled a life but felt like none. He told acquaintances he was going abroad to see the museums, to study European culture, to broaden his understanding of the world. The truth was simpler. He was bored, restless, and looking for something he could not name. He arrived in London in late June and took rooms at the Savoy Hotel. He stayed for 6 weeks, during which he attended the theater nearly every night. He had no interest in the plays themselves. He watched the actresses, studied them, really, from his seat in the private boxes. He sent flowers and notes backstage, always unsigned, always excessive, roses by the dozen. Champagne in crates. The notes were brief and strange. "You were radiant tonight." "I understand you completely." The actresses did not know who sent them. The stage managers accepted the deliveries and said nothing. Harry moved through London's social circles with the awkwardness of a man who had money but no charm. He attended parties at the homes of minor aristocrats who tolerated Americans with fortunes. He stood in corners, drinking steadily, watching conversations he was not part of. When he did speak, he dominated discussions with long, disjointed monologues about topics no one had asked about. His family's wealth, his opinions on art, his grievances against people the others had never heard of. Invitations stopped coming after a few weeks. He did not notice or did not care. In August, he left for Paris. He rented an apartment on Avenue de l'Opéra, a spacious set of rooms with tall windows overlooking the street. He hired a valet, a cook, and a housekeeper, though he rarely allowed any of them into his presence. He spent his mornings alone, drinking coffee and reading newspapers in 3 languages he barely understood. He spent his afternoons at the Louvre, wandering the galleries without looking at the paintings. He was searching for something, but he had no idea what it was. He began frequenting the cabarets and music halls of Montmartre, the Moulin Rouge, the Folies Bergère, places where performers danced and sang for crowds of tourists and wealthy expatriates. Harry went alone, always taking the same seat near the back, always ordering the same champagne. He did not speak to the other patrons. He watched the dancers with an intensity that made the waiters uncomfortable. After performances, he would send money backstage, large sums delivered by the venue staff, accompanied by unsigned cards. "For your extraordinary talent, you deserve far more than this." Some of the dancers wrote back, thanking him, asking to meet. He never responded. The attention was not the point. He wanted them to know he was watching. He wanted them to feel seen by him, even if they never saw him. He threw a party in his apartment in September, inviting a dozen people he had met casually at various venues around the city. He hired musicians, ordered cases of wine, had the rooms filled with flowers. The guests arrived and found Harry standing in the center of the main room, silent, waiting for them to acknowledge him. The party was stiff, awkward. Harry drank heavily and delivered a long, rambling toast about art and beauty and the decline of modern culture. No one knew how to respond. By midnight, most of the guests had left. Harry sat alone in the wreckage of the evening, surrounded by half-empty glasses and wilting flowers, convinced that the guests had conspired to humiliate him. He left Paris in October and traveled south to Monte Carlo. He checked into the Hôtel de Paris and spent the next 2 months at the casino. He was not a skilled gambler. He played roulette, baccarat, and poker with no strategy and no restraint. He won occasionally, lost far more often, and treated both outcomes with the same blank indifference. One evening, he lost $30,000 in less than 3 hours. He stood from the table, tipped the dealer $1,000, and returned to his hotel room without speaking to anyone. He began to develop a routine in Monte Carlo that mirrored his routines everywhere else. He woke late, ate alone, spent his afternoons gambling or walking along the waterfront. In the evenings, he attended the opera or the theater, always sitting in a private box, always leaving before the final act. He sent gifts to performers he had never met, jewelry, perfume, elaborate floral arrangements. He never included his name. He never asked for anything in return. But the isolation was deepening. He spent days without speaking to anyone except hotel staff. He wrote letters to his mother that described a life of culture and refinement. Visits to museums, friendships with European intellectuals, invitations to exclusive salons. None of it was true. His mother replied with short, formal notes encouraging him to return to Pittsburgh, to consider marriage, to think about his future. He ignored her. In December, he traveled to Vienna. He rented a villa on the outskirts of the city, a large, cold estate that had once belonged to minor nobility. He hired a staff to maintain it, though he gave them little to do. He rarely left the house. He spent weeks alone in the villa, pacing the empty rooms, drinking through the afternoons, staring out windows at landscapes he did not see. He wrote in journals, long, paranoid entries about people who had wronged him, conspiracies he imagined, grievances that went back years. He accused old classmates of spreading rumors. He accused business associates of his family of stealing. He accused servants of spying on him. None of it was coherent. None of it mattered. In February 1902, he returned to Paris. He had been abroad for 8 months. He had spent over $200,000. He had made no friends, learned nothing, changed nothing. The excess had not filled the emptiness. The travel had not given him purpose. He was the same man he had been when he left New York, paranoid, lonely, and profoundly unmoored. He stayed in Paris through the spring, repeating the same routines, attending the same venues, sending the same gifts to women who did not know his name. And then in May, he received a letter from an acquaintance in New York. The letter mentioned casually a new performer who had taken the city by storm, a young chorus girl named Evelyn Nesbit, barely 16 years old, already famous for her beauty. The letter included a photograph clipped from a magazine. Harry stared at the photograph for a long time. Then he booked passage back to New York. He left Paris 3 days later without telling anyone he was going. Harry Kendall Thaw returned to New York in June 1902 and went directly to the Knickerbocker Hotel. He unpacked his trunks, bathed, changed into a fresh suit, and asked the concierge where Evelyn Nesbit was performing. The concierge told him she was in the chorus of a show called Florodora at the Casino Theater. Harry went that night. He bought a ticket for a private box, arrived early, and sat in the dark, waiting for the curtain to rise. When Evelyn appeared on stage, Harry leaned forward in his seat and did not move for the rest of the performance. She was 16 years old, small and delicate, with long auburn hair and pale skin. She wore a white dress and moved through the choreography with a lightness that made her seem younger than she was. Harry did not watch the rest of the cast. He did not follow the plot. He watched Evelyn, and only Evelyn, as if the rest of the world had disappeared. After the show, he sent flowers backstage, white roses, dozens of them, with a card that read, "To the most beautiful girl in New York." He did not sign his name. He returned to the theater the next night, and the night after that, always sitting in the same box, always watching her with the same fixed intensity. He sent more flowers, more notes, more gifts. Evelyn did not know who they were from. She showed the cards to the other chorus girls, who giggled and speculated. Harry liked that. He liked being unknown, watching her wonder. He learned her routine. She lived with her mother and younger brother in a small apartment on the West Side. She walked to the theater each afternoon for rehearsals. She left through the stage door after performances, sometimes alone, sometimes with other girls from the cast. Harry began following her. Not closely. He stayed half a block behind, watching from doorways and street corners. He wanted to see where she went, who she spoke to, what her life looked like when she was not on stage. One evening in late June, he approached her outside the theater. She was waiting for her mother, standing near the stage door with her coat over her arm. Harry walked up to her, removed his hat, and introduced himself. He told her his name. He told her he had been sending her flowers. He told her he thought she was the most extraordinary person he had ever seen. Evelyn was polite but cautious. She had received attention from men before, stage door admirers, older men who sent gifts and invitations. She had learned to be careful. She thanked Harry for the flowers and said she needed to go. Harry asked if he could take her to dinner. She said no. He asked again the next night. She said no again. He asked every night for 2 weeks. She kept refusing. Harry did not stop. He sent more gifts, jewelry now, expensive pieces from Tiffany, delivered to the theater with cards that grew longer and more insistent. You deserve to be worshipped. I would give you anything. No one understands you the way I do. Evelyn accepted the gifts because refusing them felt dangerous. She showed them to her mother, who was both flattered and uneasy. The Nesbits were poor. Evelyn's father had died years earlier, leaving the family with almost nothing. They lived on what Evelyn earned in the chorus, which was barely enough. The gifts were worth more than they made in months. Harry began attending every performance. He no longer sat in the private boxes. He moved to the front row, where Evelyn could see him. He stared at her throughout the show, his face expressionless, his eyes never leaving her. The other performers noticed. The stage manager noticed. Evelyn noticed. She told her mother she was frightened. Her mother told her to be grateful. Men like Harry Thaw did not pay attention to girls like them, without reason. If he wanted to help them, they should let him. In August, Evelyn finally agreed to have lunch with Harry. She brought her mother. They met at a restaurant near the theater, a respectable place where Evelyn felt safe. Harry was charming that afternoon, in a way he had not been before. He asked about her life, her family, her hopes. He listened carefully to her answers and responded with what seemed like genuine interest. He told her about his family's wealth, but not in a boastful way, more as if he were apologizing for it, as if it were a burden he had not asked for. He offered to help her family financially. He said he wanted nothing in return except her friendship. Evelyn's mother accepted before Evelyn could respond. Harry began sending money to the Nesbits, small amounts at first, then larger sums. He paid their rent. He bought them furniture, clothes, and groceries. He hired a tutor for Evelyn's younger brother. The family's financial desperation eased. Evelyn felt the weight of obligation settle over her like a net. Harry asked her to dinners, to the theater, to carriage rides through Central Park. She went, always with her mother present, always aware that saying no was no longer an option. Harry was never physically aggressive. He did not try to touch her or kiss her, but his attention was suffocating. He wanted to know everything about her, where she had been, who she had spoken to, what she had thought about during the day. He asked the same questions repeatedly, as if testing her answers for inconsistencies. He began talking about other men. Were there men who paid attention to her? Did other men send her gifts? Who were they? What did they want? Evelyn told him there was no one, which was not entirely true. There had been men before Harry, admirers, suitors, older men who had taken an interest in her when she was even younger. One of them was Stanford White. She had not planned to tell Harry about Stanford White, but Harry kept asking, kept pressing, kept circling back to the question of whether there had been anyone else. One evening during dinner, Evelyn mentioned him casually. An architect, she said, a friend of the family who had helped them when they first moved to New York. Harry's expression changed. He leaned forward and asked her to tell him more. Evelyn hesitated. She could see something shift in Harry's face, something cold and focused. She changed the subject. Harry did not press further that night, but he did not forget. Over the following weeks, he returned to the question again and again. Who was Stanford White? How had Evelyn met him? What had he done for her? What had he wanted in return? Evelyn gave vague answers. She said White had been kind to her family. She said he had introduced her to people in the theater world. She said nothing about what had actually happened between them, but Harry could sense there was more. He became fixated on the name. Stanford White, the architect, the man who had known Evelyn before Harry did. The obsession shifted. It was no longer just about Evelyn. It was about the past she would not fully describe. It was about the man who had been there first. Stanford White was 51 years old in 1902 and widely regarded as one of America's most accomplished architects. He had designed grand homes for the Vanderbilt family, exclusive clubs for New York's upper class, and landmark structures that shaped the city's skyline. Known for his charm and warmth, White moved comfortably between high society and artistic circles. He was married and had a son. Yet alongside his public life, there were parts of him that existed beyond what his reputation revealed. He met Evelyn Nesbit in 1901, when she was 15. She was already working as a model for artists and photographers, her image appearing in magazines and advertisements. After seeing her photograph, White arranged an introduction through a shared acquaintance. He invited Evelyn and her mother to lunch at his apartment in the Madison Square Garden Tower, a space he had designed himself. The apartment was filled with artwork, paintings, sculptures, tapestries, and arranged with a dramatic flair, almost like a stage. White was polite, attentive, and generous. He spoke about helping Evelyn's career and offered financial assistance to her family. Mrs. Nesbit was thankful. Evelyn was 15. White soon became a regular presence in Evelyn's life. He brought her to theaters, elegant dinners, and gatherings where she met actors, painters, and writers. He introduced her to people who could open doors for her career. He bought her clothing, paid for photographs, and helped her mother with rent and expenses. The nature of the relationship was never clearly defined, but it was understood by everyone except Evelyn that White expected something in return. One evening, White invited Evelyn to his apartment alone. He told her her mother was unwell and that he would look after her so she wouldn't worry. Evelyn agreed to go. White offered her champagne, something she had never tried before, and encouraged her to drink more. The room began to feel unfocused. She recalled being led to a bedroom at the back of the apartment, with red velvet walls and mirrors above. She remembered lying down, then waking hours later feeling sore and confused, with White beside her, smiling. He told her she had done well. He told her this was simply part of growing up. Evelyn never fully explained what happened to her mother. She lacked the words and understanding to do so. At 15, she did not recognize that White's actions were neither guidance nor care. She continued seeing him because her family depended on the money, and because she did not know how to refuse a man widely described as powerful and kind. The arrangement continued for months. Dinners, private visits, and gifts that carried silent expectations. White was not outwardly harsh. He was calm and patient, careful in a way that required no force. By the time Harry Kendall Thaw began showing interest in Evelyn in 1902, her involvement with White had already ended. White had turned his attention elsewhere. Evelyn joined the chorus line, trying to build a future that did not rely on men like him. Still, she carried the experience quietly, weighed down by silence and the repeated suggestion that White had been generous and that she should feel fortunate. At first, Harry did not know the full story. He only sensed that White's name unsettled Evelyn, that she avoided discussing him, that something remained unsaid. Harry fixated on it. He asked repeatedly who White was, what role he had played, why Evelyn wouldn't explain. Evelyn resisted for months, offering vague responses and partial truths. But Harry persisted. He framed his questions as care and devotion, saying he needed to understand everything about her. He told her secrets created distance, that honesty was proof of love. The pressure never eased. Eventually, even Evelyn's mother encouraged her to tell him what he wanted to hear, believing it would finally put an end to his questions. In late 1903, Evelyn told him. They were in Harry's suite at the Knickerbocker, sitting across from each other in the dim light of the sitting room. She told him about the lunch at White's apartment, the champagne, the bedroom with the red velvet walls. She told him what White had done. She cried as she spoke. Harry sat completely still, his face blank, his hands folded in his lap. When she finished, he did not move for a long time. Then he stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the street below. He asked her to tell him again. She refused. He asked her again. his voice calm, insistent. She told him again, haltingly, trying to leave out the details that hurt most. Harry listened, memorizing every word. He asked questions, specific, invasive questions about what White had said, what he had done, how Evelyn had felt. She begged him to stop. He did not stop. He needed to know everything. He needed to see it. Over the following weeks, Harry returned to the story again and again. He made Evelyn repeat it, clarify it, relive it in front of him. He wanted her to describe the apartment, the champagne, the moment she realized what was happening. He wanted to know if she had resisted, if she had said no, if she had wanted it. Evelyn told him she had been 15. She told him she had not known what was happening. Harry nodded, took notes, and asked her to start from the beginning again. The obsession consumed him. He stopped attending the theater. He stopped going out. He spent his days in his hotel suite, pacing, drinking, thinking about Stanford White. He hired private investigators to follow White, to document his movements, to find out if there were other women. There were. Harry collected the information like evidence, building a case in his mind against a man he had never spoken to. He saw White occasionally, at the opera or at restaurants, always at a distance. White did not know who Harry was. He did not recognize him, did not acknowledge him. Harry would stare at him across crowded rooms, his jaw tight, his hands clenched. Evelyn begged him to let it go. He told her he would. He did not. He began talking about White as if he were a demon, a predator, a monster who had stolen something from Evelyn that could never be returned. He told Evelyn that White had destroyed her innocence, that he had ruined her, that Harry was the only one who could understand the depth of what had been taken. Evelyn tried to tell him that she did not feel ruined, that she wanted to move forward, that the past was over. Harry did not hear her. He had constructed a story in his mind, and in that story, Evelyn was a victim, White was a villain, and Harry was the man who would make it right. He began carrying a gun. In the spring of 1903, Harry Kendall Thaw asked Evelyn Nesbit to marry him. They were sitting in a restaurant near Union Square, a place he had chosen because it was public enough to seem respectable, but quiet enough that no one would overhear. Evelyn hesitated. She did not love Harry. She was not sure she even liked him, but she was 18 years old. Her family was entirely dependent on his money, and she had learned over the past year that saying no to Harry Thaw was not a simple matter. She told him she needed time to think. Harry's face darkened. He leaned across the table and said very quietly that he had given her everything: money, security, devotion. He had asked for nothing except her honesty, her time, her loyalty. And now, when he asked for the one thing that mattered, she needed time. Evelyn felt the walls close in. She said yes that night, not because she wanted to, but because refusing felt more dangerous than agreeing. They were married on April 4th, 1905 in Pittsburgh at the Thaw family estate. It was not a large wedding. Mary Copley Thaw attended, along with a handful of family members and a few of Harry's acquaintances. Evelyn's mother was there, smiling, relieved that her daughter had secured a fortune. Evelyn wore a white dress and stood beside Harry in the parlor while a minister recited vows she barely heard. Harry held her hand tightly throughout the ceremony. When it was over, he kissed her on the cheek and whispered that she was his now, completely. They left for Europe 2 days later. Harry had planned an extended honeymoon. Paris, Vienna, the Austrian countryside. He told Evelyn it would be romantic, that they would finally have time alone together, away from New York, away from the past. Evelyn packed her trunks and boarded the ship with a sense of dread she could not name. They arrived in Paris in late April and stayed at the Hotel Ritz. Harry had reserved a suite overlooking the Place Vendôme, expensive and ornate. For the first few days, he was almost cheerful. He took Evelyn to dinners, to the theater, to galleries and shops. He bought her jewelry, dresses, perfume. He was attentive in a way that felt smothering. He wanted to know where she was at all times. He did not want her to leave the hotel without him. He did not want her to speak to strangers, to make eye contact with men, to go anywhere he had not approved first. Then the interrogations began again. They were sitting in the suite one evening after dinner when Harry asked Evelyn to tell him about Stanford White. She said she had already told him everything. He said she had not. There were details missing, moments she had left out, things she was still hiding. Evelyn insisted there was nothing else to tell. Harry's voice remained calm, but his eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. He told her to start from the beginning. She refused. He asked again. She started crying. He waited until she stopped, then asked her again. This became the pattern. Every few days, Harry would return to the subject of Stanford White. He would ask Evelyn to describe the apartment, the champagne, the bedroom. He would ask what White had said to her, how he had touched her, what she had felt. He made her repeat the story until the words lost meaning, until she was reciting it like a script she had memorized against her will. He took notes. He asked for clarifications. He corrected her when she misremembered details from previous tellings. It was not a conversation. It was an interrogation. Evelyn tried to leave once in early May. She told Harry she wanted to go back to New York, that she was not feeling well, that the honeymoon was not what she had hoped. Harry said no. They were staying in Europe. They had only just arrived. He had planned everything, and she was not going to ruin it by being ungrateful. Evelyn packed her bags anyway. Harry found her in the bedroom, suitcase open on the bed. He did not raise his voice. He simply closed the suitcase, locked it, and took the key. He told her she was upset that she did not know what she wanted, that he was taking care of her. He told her she should rest. In June, they traveled to Austria. Harry had rented a castle, Schloss Katzenstein, a remote estate in the countryside outside Salzburg. It was beautiful in a cold, austere way, surrounded by forests and mountains. There were servants, but they spoke only German and kept their distance. Evelyn felt more isolated than she had ever felt in her life. The interrogations intensified. Harry would wake Evelyn in the middle of the night and demand that she tell him about White again. He would accuse her of lying, of protecting White, of hiding the truth. Evelyn would beg him to stop. He would not stop. He told her that if she really loved him, she would help him understand. He told her that his obsession with White was her fault, that if she had been honest from the beginning, none of this would be happening. One night, he hit her. It was not a violent blow, not the kind that left visible bruises, but it was deliberate. She had refused to answer a question about White, and Harry had slapped her across the face once, sharply. Then he had apologized immediately, kneeling beside her, holding her hands, crying. He said he had not meant to do it. He said he loved her. He said she made him crazy, that she brought out the worst in him, that if she would just tell him the truth, he would never lose control again. Evelyn tried to leave again. She went to the servants, trying to communicate through gestures and broken phrases that she needed help, that she needed to go to the train station. The servants brought Harry. He dismissed them, locked Evelyn in her room, and sat outside the door for hours. When he finally let her out, he told her she was being hysterical. He told her she did not understand how much he loved her. He told her that no one else would ever care for her the way he did. The violence became more frequent, not constant, not predictable, but present. A shove, a slap. Once a leather strap he took from his luggage and used on her back. Afterward, he would cry, apologize, beg for forgiveness. He would tell her it was her fault, that she provoked him, that if she would just stop lying to him, everything would be fine. Evelyn stopped trying to leave. She stopped arguing. She learned to be silent, to answer his questions, to endure. They stayed at the castle for 2 months. When they finally left in August, Evelyn was thin, exhausted, and afraid. Harry seemed satisfied. He had gotten what he wanted: complete control, complete access to her past, complete dominance over her present. He told her they would return to New York soon. He told her everything would be better now. He told her she had finally learned to be a good wife. The castle had 19 rooms, most of them empty. Harry had chosen it for its isolation, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest, accessible only by a narrow road that wound through the mountains. The servants who came with the estate lived in quarters separate from the main building. They prepared meals, cleaned the rooms Harry and Evelyn used, and otherwise remained invisible. Evelyn saw them occasionally through windows or in hallways, but they would not meet her eyes. She wondered if Harry had told them something about her, some instruction to ignore her if she asked for help. The days had no structure. Harry woke late, sometimes in the afternoon, and spent hours in the library, a cold room lined with books in German that he could not read. Evelyn was not allowed to leave the castle grounds without him. She spent her time in her bedroom or walking the perimeter of the estate, always within sight of the windows. Harry watched her from inside. She could feel his eyes on her, even when she could not see him. He had brought a leather riding crop with him from Paris. Evelyn had seen it in his luggage when they first arrived at the castle, but had not thought about it. There were no horses at the estate. She asked him once why he had brought it. He told her it was for discipline. She did not ask again. The first time he used it was in late June. They had been arguing, not loudly, but with the tense circular rhythm that had become familiar. Harry wanted Evelyn to describe again the bedroom in Stanford White's apartment. She had refused. She was exhausted. She had told him everything dozens of times. There was nothing left to say. Harry had gone quiet, which was worse than anger. He had stood, left the room, and returned a few minutes later with the crop in his hand. He told Evelyn to stand. She did not move. He repeated the instruction, his voice calm, almost gentle. She stood. He told her to turn around. She hesitated. He stepped closer and placed his hand on her shoulder, guiding her to face the wall. Then he struck her across the back once. The pain was sharp, startling. She cried out. He struck her again and again. She counted 5 blows before he stopped. Then he set the crop on the table, sat down, and asked her if she was ready to answer his questions now. She answered. She told him what he wanted to hear, repeating the story she had told so many times it no longer felt like her own. Harry listened, nodding occasionally, making small corrections when she deviated from previous versions. When she finished, he thanked her. He said he appreciated her honesty. He said he hoped they would not have to go through this again. They went through it again 3 days later, and then again a week after that. The pattern was always the same. Harry would ask about White. Evelyn would refuse or hesitate. Harry would retrieve the crop. Evelyn would comply. Afterward, he would be calm, almost affectionate. He would sit beside her and talk about their future together, about the life they would have when they returned to New York, about how much he loved her. He never apologized for the violence. He framed it as something she had made necessary, something he had been forced to do because she had not been truthful or obedient. Evelyn stopped eating regularly. The servants brought meals to her room, but she left most of the food untouched. She lost weight quickly. Her dresses, which had fit perfectly when they arrived in Austria, now hung loose on her frame. Harry noticed but said nothing. She slept poorly, waking in the middle of the night to find Harry sitting in a chair near her bed watching her. He would tell her he had been unable to sleep, that he had wanted to make sure she was all right. She would pretend to believe him. In mid-July, Evelyn tried to send a letter. She had written to her mother a short note that said only that she wanted to come home, that she was not well, that she needed help. She gave the letter to one of the servants, a young woman who worked in the kitchen, and tried to communicate through gestures that it needed to be posted. The servant took the letter and nodded. 2 days later, Harry confronted Evelyn with the letter in his hand. The servant had given it to him. He read it aloud, his voice mocking. Then he tore it into pieces and told Evelyn that if she tried to contact anyone again, he would make sure her mother never received another dollar from the Thaw family. Evelyn realized then that there was no way out. Her mother depended on Harry's money. Her brother's education was paid for by Harry. If she left, if she made him angry enough, he could destroy her family financially. And even if she did manage to escape, where would she go? She was in a foreign country, spoke no German, had no money of her own. She was entirely dependent on a man who hurt her and called it love. The violence escalated in August. Harry began using the crop more frequently, sometimes without any clear provocation. He would tell Evelyn to come to the library, and she would know what was coming. He would make her stand against the wall, sometimes fully clothed, sometimes not. He would strike her methodically, counting the blows aloud. Afterward, he would examine the marks on her skin with a strange clinical detachment, as if he were studying the results of an experiment. One evening, he told her to undress completely and kneel on the floor. She refused. He did not argue. He simply waited, standing in the center of the room with the crop in his hand, his expression blank. She knelt. He circled her slowly, not touching her, just looking. Then he left the room and locked the door from the outside. She stayed there for hours, naked and shivering on the cold floor, until he returned and told her she could get dressed. By the time they left the castle in late August, Evelyn had stopped resisting. She answered Harry's questions without hesitation. She obeyed his instructions immediately. She had learned that compliance did not prevent the violence, but it sometimes delayed it. She had learned that Harry did not want her to fight back. He wanted her to submit, to break, to become entirely his. They traveled back to Paris, then to London, then to New York. The honeymoon had lasted 5 months. Evelyn had entered it as a reluctant bride. She returned as something else, smaller, quieter, emptied of whatever resistance she had once possessed. Harry seemed pleased. He told her she had matured. He told her she had finally learned what it meant to be his wife. When they arrived in New York in September 1905, Evelyn's mother met them at the dock. She embraced her daughter and told her how wonderful she looked. Evelyn said nothing. Harry smiled and told Mrs. Nesbit that the honeymoon had been a great success. They moved into a suite at the Hotel Lorraine on Fifth Avenue. Harry had chosen it for its proximity to the theaters, the restaurants, the places where New York's wealthy gathered and pretended to live. The suite was large, expensively furnished, with tall windows overlooking the street. Evelyn spent most of her time in the bedroom, curtains drawn, lying on the bed in the dim afternoon light. Harry came and went. He attended the opera, visited his club, gambled at private card games. He did not invite Evelyn. He told her she needed rest, that she looked pale, that she should stay in the hotel until she felt stronger. Her mother visited once a week, always in the afternoon, always when Harry was out. Mrs. Nesbit would sit in the parlor and talk about the apartment Harry had rented for her and Evelyn's brother, about the furniture he had bought, about how fortunate they all were. Evelyn would sit across from her, nodding, saying little. Her mother did not ask about the honeymoon. She did not ask why Evelyn looked so thin, why her hands trembled when she poured tea, why she flinched when doors opened suddenly. She talked about money and gratitude and the importance of being a good wife. Evelyn listened and said nothing. Harry's obsession with Stanford White had not diminished. If anything, it had grown sharper, more focused. He kept a notebook now, a leather-bound journal where he recorded sightings of White around the city. What time? What location? Who he was with. He hired private investigators to follow White, to document his movements, to report back on his activities. The investigators provided weekly updates. White attended the theater. White dined at Delmonico's. White was seen entering a building on West 24th Street with a young woman. Harry read the reports carefully, underlining certain passages, making notes in the margins. He talked about White constantly. At breakfast, he would read aloud from the newspapers, pointing out mentions of White's architectural projects, his social engagements, his presence at charity events. He would speculate about White's private life, about the women he was seeing, about the depravity Harry was certain existed behind White's public reputation. Evelyn would sit across from him, silent, her coffee untouched. Harry did not need her to respond. He was talking to himself, constructing a narrative in which White was not just a man who had hurt Evelyn years ago, but a monster whose existence was an insult to decency. In October, Harry began carrying a revolver. It was a small pistol, nickel-plated, easily concealed in the pocket of his coat. He showed it to Evelyn one evening, holding it in his palm as if it were something precious. He told her it made him feel safer. He told her there were dangerous people in the city, that a man needed to protect himself and his wife. Evelyn stared at the gun and felt something cold settle in her chest. She asked him why he needed it. He smiled and said she worried too much. They attended the theater occasionally, always sitting in private boxes, always leaving before the final act. Harry would scan the audience obsessively, looking for White. Sometimes he found him. White would be seated several rows away, laughing with companions, entirely unaware of Harry's presence. Harry would lean forward in his seat, his body rigid, his eyes locked on White until Evelyn touched his arm and reminded him to breathe. Once in November, White glanced in their direction. His eyes passed over Harry without recognition. Harry's jaw tightened. He stood abruptly and told Evelyn they were leaving. On the walk back to the hotel, Harry did not speak. When they reached the suite, he went directly to the desk where he kept his notebook and wrote for over an hour. Evelyn watched him from the doorway. His handwriting was fast, jagged, filling page after page. She did not ask what he was writing. She already knew. In December, they attended a performance at Madison Square Garden, the theater on the roof of the building Stanford White had designed. Harry insisted on going, though Evelyn begged him not to. She knew White attended performances there. She knew Harry was looking for him. They arrived early and took seats near the center of the theater. Harry sat with his hands folded in his lap, his eyes moving constantly across the crowd. White did not appear that night. Harry was visibly disappointed. On the way out, he stopped on the rooftop and stared at the city below, the electric lights spreading out in every direction. He said quietly that this place belonged to White, that everywhere they went in New York was marked by him. Evelyn said nothing. Harry's behavior at home grew more erratic. He would wake Evelyn in the middle of the night to ask her questions about White. The same questions, over and over, as if the answers might change. He accused her of still thinking about White, of missing him, of wishing she had married him instead. Evelyn denied it, but Harry did not believe her. He told her she was a liar. He told her she had ruined his life by letting White touch her. He told her she owed him the truth, and until he got it, she would never be free. The physical violence had lessened since their return to New York, but the psychological control had tightened. Harry monitored Evelyn's every movement. He read her letters before they were sent. He questioned the hotel staff about who had visited, who had called, who had asked for her. He controlled her money, her clothing, her access to the outside world. She was not allowed to leave the hotel without his permission. She was not allowed to see friends from her time in the chorus. She was not allowed to make decisions about her own life. In early 1906, Evelyn realized she was pregnant. She told Harry, hoping it might shift his focus, might give him something to think about other than Stanford White. Harry received the news without emotion. He told her she should rest, that she should take care of herself. Then he returned to his notebook, to his surveillance reports, to his obsession. The pregnancy did not change anything. By spring, Evelyn had become a shadow in her own life. She moved through the hotel suite like a ghost, eating little, sleeping poorly, speaking only when spoken to. Harry seemed not to notice. He was focused entirely on White now, tracking his movements, planning something Evelyn could not see but could feel approaching. She knew Harry carried the gun. She knew he talked about White with a hatred that had gone beyond reason. She knew something was going to happen. She did not know when. She did not know if she could stop it. On June 25th, 1906, Harry told Evelyn they were going to the theater that night. There was a new show on the roof of Madison Square Garden. He had already bought the tickets. The evening was warm, the city humid and restless. Harry and Evelyn left the Hotel Lorraine just after 8 o'clock and took a cab to Madison Square Garden. Evelyn wore a white dress and a wide-brimmed hat. Harry wore a dark suit and carried a light overcoat despite the heat. They did not speak during the ride. Evelyn stared out the window at the streets passing by, at the crowds moving through the summer evening, at the electric lights that had begun to flicker on across the city. She felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. They arrived at the theater on the rooftop of Madison Square Garden just before 9. The show was called Mam'zelle Champagne, a light musical revue with chorus girls and comedic songs. The rooftop was open to the air, strung with electric lights, filled with tables and chairs where the audience could sit and drink while they watched. It was a warm night, and the crowd was large, well-dressed, animated. Harry and Evelyn were seated near the front. Harry ordered champagne. Evelyn did not drink hers. The show began. Harry did not watch the stage. He turned in his seat, scanning the audience, his eyes moving methodically from table to table. Evelyn knew what he was looking for. She reached across and touched his arm, a silent plea for him to stop, to just watch the performance, to let the evening pass without incident. Harry pulled his arm away and continued searching the crowd. Halfway through the first act, Harry found him. Stanford White was seated several tables away, near the back of the theater, alone. He was watching the stage, a glass of wine in his hand, his expression relaxed. He did not see Harry. Harry stared at him for a long time, his body completely still. Then he stood. Evelyn grabbed his hand. She asked him where he was going. He told her to wait. He told her he would be right back. She held his hand tighter and begged him to sit down. He pulled free and walked away. Harry moved slowly through the audience, weaving between tables, his hand in the pocket of his coat. No one paid attention to him. The performance continued. The orchestra played. The chorus girls sang. Harry reached Stanford White's table and stopped directly beside him. White looked up, mildly curious, not recognizing the man standing over him. Harry removed the revolver from his coat pocket. He raised it and fired 3 times into Stanford White's face. The shots were loud, sharp, cutting through the music. White's head snapped back, his body slumped forward, blood pooling on the white tablecloth. The orchestra stopped. The performers froze. For a moment, the entire rooftop was silent. Then the screaming began. Women stood, knocking over chairs, their voices high and panicked. Men rushed toward White's table, toward Harry, uncertain whether to help or flee. Harry stood in the center of the chaos, the gun still in his hand, raised above his head. He looked around at the crowd, at the faces staring at him in horror, and said calmly and clearly, "He ruined my wife!" Evelyn remained seated at their table, frozen, unable to move. She watched Harry standing there, the gun in the air, his face blank. She watched the crowd surge around him. She watched the theater staff rush toward White's body, then step back when they realized he was already dead. She felt nothing. The moment did not feel real. It felt like something she was watching from a great distance, through glass. A fireman who had been in the audience approached Harry and took the gun from his hand without resistance. Harry let him. He did not struggle. He did not run. He stood quietly, waiting as if he had been expecting this. The police arrived within minutes. They placed Harry in handcuffs and led him toward the exit. As he passed Evelyn's table, he looked at her and smiled. He told her not to worry. He told her everything would be fine now. Evelyn was escorted from the rooftop by a police officer. She was taken to a room inside the building and asked to wait. She sat in a chair and stared at the wall. People came and went, officers, theater staff, a doctor who checked her pulse and asked if she needed anything. She said nothing. She could still hear the gunshots in her mind, the sharp crack of each one, the silence that followed. She could still see White's head snapping back, the blood on the tablecloth. She could still hear Harry's voice, calm and certain. "He ruined my wife." The newspapers arrived at the scene within the hour. Reporters crowded outside the building, shouting questions at anyone who emerged. The story was already spreading through the city. Stanford White, the famous architect, murdered in the theater he had designed, shot by a millionaire from Pittsburgh. By midnight, the first editions were on the streets. The headlines were sensational, lurid, designed to sell papers. Architect slain in front of hundreds. Millionaire kills love rival. Jealous husband's deadly revenge. Harry was taken to the Tombs, the city jail in Lower Manhattan. He was placed in a cell and questioned by detectives. He was calm, cooperative, almost cheerful. He admitted to the shooting immediately. He said he had no regrets. He said Stanford White had deserved to die, that he had destroyed Evelyn's innocence, that Harry had only done what any man would do to protect his wife. The detectives took notes. Harry asked if he could have something to eat. They brought him a meal. He ate it slowly, methodically, as if he were dining at a hotel. Evelyn was taken to the same jail and placed in a separate cell. She was not charged with anything, but the police wanted to keep her nearby for questioning. She lay on the narrow cot and stared at the ceiling. She thought about Stanford White, about the last time she had seen him alive, years ago, before Harry, before everything had collapsed. She thought about Harry, about the way he had smiled at her as the police led him away, as if he had just given her a gift. She thought about the gun, the blood, the screaming. She thought about the fact that she was 19 years old and her life was over. The next morning, Harry's mother arrived from Pittsburgh with a team of lawyers. They met with Harry for hours, discussing strategy, preparing for what they all knew would be a long and public trial. Mary Copley Thaw was calm, efficient, focused. She had spent her life managing crises caused by her youngest son. This was simply the largest one yet. She had money, lawyers, and a plan. She would save Harry, no matter what it cost. Evelyn was released from the jail and taken to a hotel under police supervision. She was told not to leave the city. She was told she would be called to testify. She lay in the hotel bed and did not move for 2 days. When the newspapers arrived, she did not read them. She already knew what they would say. The trial began on January 23, 1907, 7 months after the shooting. The courtroom was packed every day. Journalists, spectators, society women who arrived early to secure seats in the gallery. They came to watch Harry Kendall Thaw, to see Evelyn Nesbit, to hear the details of a story the newspapers had been printing in installments since June. The trial was not really about whether Harry had killed Stanford White. He had admitted that immediately, in front of hundreds of witnesses. The trial was about why he had done it, and whether that was enough to set him free. Harry's lawyers had built their defense on a single strategy: temporary insanity caused by what they called brainstorm. They argued that Harry had been driven mad by learning what White had done to Evelyn, that his mind had snapped under the weight of that knowledge, that the shooting had been the act of a man who was not in control of himself. It was a defense that required Evelyn to testify, to tell the courtroom what White had done to her when she was 15, to make the jury believe that Harry's violence had been a rational response to an unbearable truth. The prosecution argued something simpler. Harry Kendall Thaw was a wealthy man who had murdered another man in cold blood in front of witnesses and should be held accountable like anyone else. They pointed to the fact that Harry had planned the evening carefully, that he had brought a gun, that he had approached White deliberately and fired 3 times at point-blank range. They argued that Harry was not insane. He was entitled, obsessed, and convinced that his money would protect him from consequences. Evelyn was called to testify in early February. She wore a simple blue dress and kept her eyes down as she walked to the witness stand. The courtroom was silent. Everyone leaned forward to hear her. Harry's lead attorney, Delphine Delmas, questioned her gently, carefully, guiding her through the story Harry had made her repeat so many times. She described meeting Stanford White, the dinners, the champagne, the bedroom with the red velvet walls. She spoke quietly, her voice barely audible, but the courtroom heard every word. The newspapers printed her testimony in full the next day. The prosecution cross-examined her. They asked if she had gone to White's apartment willingly. She said yes, but she had been 15, and she had not known what would happen. They asked if she had continued to see White after that night. She said yes, because her family had needed his money. They asked if she loved Harry Thaw. She hesitated. She said yes. The hesitation was noted in every newspaper account. Harry sat at the defense table throughout Evelyn's testimony, watching her with an expression that oscillated between pride and suspicion. He took notes. He whispered to his lawyers. When Evelyn described what White had done to her, Harry wiped his eyes with a handkerchief, as if he were hearing it for the first time. The jury watched him. Some seemed moved, others seemed skeptical. The trial lasted 11 weeks. The courtroom became a theater. The lawyers, performers, the witnesses, characters in a story that the public consumed with fascination and disgust. Harry's wealth was discussed constantly. His inheritance, his allowance, the money his mother had spent on his defense. The newspapers estimated she had already paid over $500,000 to his legal team. Mary Copley Thaw attended the trial every day, sitting in the front row, her face impassive, her hands folded in her lap. She did not testify. She did not need to. Her presence was enough, a reminder that the Thaw family would spend whatever it took to protect their son. The defense called doctors who testified that Harry was insane, that he suffered from delusions, that he was not responsible for his actions. The prosecution called doctors who testified that Harry was perfectly sane, that he knew exactly what he was doing when he pulled the trigger. The jury heard both sides and struggled to decide which version of Harry Kendall Thaw was true, the madman or the murderer. On April 12, 1907, after deliberating for 47 hours, the jury announced they were deadlocked. 7 jurors had voted for conviction. 5 had voted for acquittal. The judge declared a mistrial. Harry was returned to the Tombs to await a second trial. Evelyn left the courtroom without speaking to anyone. The newspapers called it the greatest courtroom drama in American history. The trial had cost the Thaw family over $1 million. It had accomplished nothing. The second trial began in January 1908, almost 2 years after the shooting. The arguments were the same. The witnesses, largely the same, but the atmosphere had changed. The public was tired of the story. The newspapers still covered it, but with less fervor, fewer headlines. Evelyn testified again, repeating the same story in the same quiet voice. Harry sat at the defense table, thinner now, more erratic. He interrupted his own lawyers. He shouted at the prosecution. The judge ordered him to be silent. Harry's mother sat in the front row, her expression unchanged, as if she had always known it would come to this. On February 1st, 1908, the jury returned a verdict: not guilty by reason of insanity. Harry Kendall Thaw would not go to prison. Instead, he would be committed to the Matawan State Hospital for the criminally insane, to be held there until doctors determined he was no longer a danger to himself or others. Harry smiled when the verdict was read. His lawyers shook his hand. His mother allowed herself a brief, tight smile. Evelyn was not in the courtroom. She had stopped attending weeks earlier. Harry was transferred to Matawan in February 1908. The hospital was a sprawling complex of brick buildings in upstate New York, surrounded by high walls and guard towers. It housed men who had committed crimes while insane, men who might never leave. Harry was assigned a private room, far larger than the cells most patients occupied. His mother ensured he had books, newspapers, and decent meals. She visited once a month, bringing money for the staff, ensuring her son was treated well. Harry adjusted to Matawan quickly. He was not a model patient, but he was not violent. He complained constantly about the food, the staff, the other patients, the boredom. He wrote letters to his lawyers demanding they work on securing his release. He wrote letters to Evelyn, long and rambling, asking her to visit, telling her he loved her, accusing her of abandoning him. Evelyn did not respond. She had not seen Harry since the trial ended. She had no intention of seeing him again. In 1909, Evelyn filed for divorce. Harry contested it from Matawan, writing furious letters to his lawyers, insisting that Evelyn was still his wife, that she owed him loyalty, that he had killed for her, and she had betrayed him. The divorce was granted in 1910. Evelyn was awarded no alimony. Harry's mother made sure of that. Evelyn left New York and tried to disappear. Harry remained at Matawan for 5 years. His lawyers filed petition after petition for his release, arguing that he was sane, that he had been rehabilitated, that he no longer posed a threat. The hospital's doctors disagreed. They noted his paranoia, his inability to accept responsibility for his actions, and his continued obsession with Stanford White. But money has a way of eroding resistance. In 1913, after years of legal battles and substantial payments to various officials, a judge ordered Harry's release. He walked out of Matawan on July 16, 1913, 7 years after the shooting. He was 42 years old. He was free. Harry Kendall Thaw left Matawan State Hospital on a Tuesday morning in July 1913. His mother had arranged for a private car to meet him at the gates. She was not there herself. She had sent lawyers instead, men in dark suits who shook Harry's hand and told him how pleased they were to see him free. Harry ignored them. He climbed into the car and stared out the window as they drove south toward New York City. The landscape had not changed. 7 years had passed, and the world looked exactly as it had when he left it. He returned to Pittsburgh first, to the family estate on the hill. The house was the same, large, cold, filled with furniture no one sat on, and rooms no one entered. His mother was waiting in the parlor. She stood when he entered, allowed him to kiss her cheek, then sat back down and told him the rules. He was not to leave Pittsburgh without her permission. He was not to speak to reporters. He was not to do anything that would bring further shame to the family name. Harry nodded and said he understood. He understood nothing. He lasted 3 weeks in Pittsburgh before the restlessness became unbearable. The house felt like another prison, quieter than Matawan, but just as confining. His older brother Edward had died in 1909, while Harry was still institutionalized. The family businesses were now managed by distant cousins and hired executives. Harry had no role in any of it. His mother gave him an allowance, smaller than before, carefully controlled. She told him it was for his own protection. Harry did not argue. He took the money and left. He moved to New York in August and rented rooms at the Hotel McAlpin on Broadway. The city had changed in 7 years. New buildings, new crowds, new rhythms he did not recognize. The theater district had expanded. The rooftop theater at Madison Square Garden, where he had shot Stanford White, had been torn down. The building itself was scheduled for demolition. Harry walked past it one afternoon and stood on the sidewalk, staring up at the facade. He felt nothing. The act that had defined his life, that had consumed 7 years, now seemed distant, unreal, as if it had happened to someone else. He tried to resume the life he had lived before Matewan, but the city had moved on without him. The clubs he had frequented no longer admitted him. The restaurants where he had once been tolerated now turned him away at the door. His face was too well known, his name too infamous. People stared at him on the street, whispered as he passed. Some looked at him with fascination, others with disgust. He was a spectacle, a curiosity, a man who had killed someone famous and walked free. He was not a person. He was a story. He spent his days alone in his hotel room, reading newspapers, writing letters that no one answered. He wrote to Evelyn constantly, long letters that cycled between affection and accusation. He told her he still loved her. He told her she had abandoned him. He told her she owed him something for what he had done, for the sacrifice he had made. Evelyn never replied. She had remarried and moved to California, as far from Harry Kendall Thaw as geography allowed. Harry did not know this. He kept writing, kept waiting for a response that would never come. In 1914, Harry was arrested again. The details were vague, deliberately obscured by his mother's lawyers. A young man, 19 years old, had accused Harry of assault. The case was settled quietly. The charges dropped after a significant payment changed hands. The newspapers reported it in small paragraphs buried on back pages. The public had grown tired of Harry Kendall Thaw. The trial had been thrilling, but the aftermath was only sordid and sad. Harry moved to Philadelphia after the arrest, at his mother's insistence. She wanted him out of New York, away from the places where his past could catch up with him so easily. He rented an apartment near Rittenhouse Square and tried once again to build something resembling a life. He attended lectures at the university, though he was not enrolled. He went to concerts and sat alone in the back row. He ate dinner at the same restaurant every evening, always at the same table, always ordering the same meal. The staff knew him, tolerated him, and kept their distance. In 1916, he was arrested again. This time the charge was more serious: kidnapping and assault of a teenage boy. Harry had lured the boy to his apartment with promises of money, then beaten him severely when the boy tried to leave. The boy's parents went to the police. Harry's lawyers descended immediately, but the case could not be buried as easily as the others. There were witnesses, medical records, a victim willing to testify. The trial was held in Pennsylvania, far from the New York headlines that had once made Harry famous. This time, the courtroom was not packed with spectators. This time, there were no society women vying for seats, no reporters filing breathless updates. The case was covered, but briefly, without the lurid fascination that had surrounded the White murder. Harry was older now, his fortune diminished by legal fees and mismanagement. His name no longer quite so powerful. The jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to 7 years in the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. Harry's mother paid for his legal appeals, but she did so mechanically, without hope. She was 73 years old, exhausted by decades of managing her son's disasters. She visited him once in prison, sat across from him in the visiting room, and told him she had done everything she could. He asked her for money. She said no. It was the first time she had ever refused him. He cursed at her, called her cruel, and demanded she help him. She stood and left without responding. She would never see him again. Harry served 4 years of his sentence before being released in 1920. He was 49 years old. His mother had died while he was in prison, leaving her estate to her remaining children and grandchildren. Harry's share had been placed in a trust he could not access directly, managed by lawyers who distributed a monthly allowance barely sufficient to cover his rent. The fortune he had inherited at 18, the wealth that had insulated him from every consequence, had been eroded by legal fees, settlements, and the slow attrition of time. He was not poor, but he was no longer powerful. The money that had once made problems disappear could now only delay them. He moved to a boarding house in Pittsburgh, a modest building far from the estate where he had grown up. He lived in a single room on the third floor, ate meals in the communal dining room, and spent his days sitting by the window watching the street below. The boarding house on Penn Avenue smelled of boiled cabbage and coal smoke. Harry's room was on the third floor at the end of a narrow hallway that creaked when anyone walked down it. The room had a single bed, a dresser with a cracked mirror, a wooden chair, and a window that overlooked an alley where trash accumulated in drifts against the brick walls. This was not poverty. Harry still received his monthly allowance, still had enough to pay for his room and meals. But it was closer to poverty than he had ever been. The distance between this room and the estate on the hill was less than 5 miles. It felt like a different country. He was 50 years old in 1921. His hair had gone gray. His face, once soft with youth and excess, had hardened into something gaunt and suspicious. He moved through the boarding house like a ghost, eating breakfast in silence at the communal table, walking the streets in the afternoons, returning to his room before dark. The other tenants knew who he was. The newspapers had made sure of that, but they did not speak to him. He preferred it that way. He spent his days writing letters to lawyers asking about the trust, demanding access to more money, to distant relatives asking for loans that were never granted, to government officials complaining about imagined conspiracies, insisting he had been framed, that his arrests had been orchestrated by enemies of his family. The letters were long, rambling, incoherent. Most went unanswered. The ones that received replies were brief and dismissive. Harry kept every response in a drawer, reading them over and over, searching for hidden meanings that did not exist. He still thought about Stanford White. Not constantly, not with the consuming obsession that had driven him to murder, but the name surfaced in his mind at odd moments. When he passed a building he thought White might have designed, when he saw a photograph in a newspaper of an architectural project, when he lay awake at night and the past unspooled in the dark. He did not regret killing White. He regretted that it had not solved anything. He had believed, truly believed, that White's death would free him from something. Instead, it had only trapped him further. Evelyn existed in his mind as a fixed point, unchanged by time. He did not know she had aged, that she had struggled, that she had tried to build a career in silent films and failed, that she had drifted through bad marriages and worse decisions. He remembered her as she had been at 18, small, pale, silent. He wrote to her occasionally, letters that were returned unopened. He did not understand why she would not forgive him. He had killed for her. What more could a man do to prove his love? In 1922, Harry was arrested for public intoxication. He had been found in a park at 2 a.m, shouting at no one, disheveled and incoherent. The police took him to the station, held him overnight, released him in the morning with a fine he could barely pay. The incident was reported in a small paragraph in the Pittsburgh Post. Harry K. Thaw, once prominent in New York society, arrested for disorderly conduct. The word once carried all the weight of his collapse. He tried briefly to reclaim some version of his old life. He went to the theater, bought a ticket for the cheapest seat, sat in the back row watching a play he did not follow. During intermission, he stood in the lobby and waited for someone to recognize him, to acknowledge him, to remember who he had been. No one did. The crowd moved around him as if he were invisible. He left before the second act and walked back to the boarding house in the rain. His health began to fail in 1923. He developed a persistent cough that kept him awake at night. He ignored it for months until he began coughing up blood. A doctor examined him and told him his lungs were damaged, likely from years of heavy drinking and poor care. The doctor prescribed rest, clean air, a better diet. Harry could afford none of these things on his allowance. He continued as before, coughing through the nights, waking exhausted, spending his days in the chair by the window. He was hospitalized briefly in 1924 for pneumonia. The hospital was a public ward, crowded and understaffed. Harry lay in a narrow bed surrounded by men who were dying of industrial accidents, of poverty, of lives worn down by labor. He recovered slowly, discharged after 2 weeks with instructions he did not follow. The hospital bill consumed most of his monthly allowance. He returned to the boarding house thinner, weaker, angrier. The 1920s moved forward without him. The city changed. New buildings, new industries, new fortunes being made by men who had not inherited anything. Harry watched from his window and felt the world accelerating past him. He was a relic of the Gilded Age, a man whose wealth had been built on coal and railroads, industries that still existed but no longer defined power the way they once had. His family's name still carried weight in Pittsburgh, but it was the weight of the past, not the present. The Thaws were remembered, but they were not relevant. In 1926, Harry received a letter from a journalist in New York. The journalist was writing a book about the Stanford White murder and wanted to interview Harry for it. The letter was polite, professional, offering a small payment for Harry's time. Harry read the letter 3 times, then burned it in the ashtray beside his bed. He would not be reduced to a chapter in someone else's book. He would not explain himself to a stranger. The story was his, and he would take it with him. He stopped leaving his room regularly in 1927. He was 56 years old and looked 70. The landlady brought meals to his door, which he ate sparingly. He stopped writing letters. He stopped reading newspapers. He sat in the chair by the window and watched the alley below, the movements of strangers, the passage of days that had no names. The money kept coming, deposited by lawyers who managed the trust his mother had established. It was enough to keep him alive. It was not enough for anything else. In 1928, Harry Kendall Thaw was committed to the Pennsylvania Hospital for Mental Diseases. The commitment was not dramatic. No police, no courtroom, no headlines. His landlady had called a doctor after finding Harry unconscious in his room, surrounded by empty bottles, muttering incoherently when she tried to wake him. The doctor examined him and made a single phone call. 2 orderlies arrived with a van. Harry was taken to the hospital on a gray morning in March, still wearing the clothes he had slept in, still muttering about conspiracies he could not articulate. The hospital was a sprawling campus on the outskirts of Philadelphia. Brick buildings connected by covered walkways surrounded by lawns that were neatly trimmed by patient labor. It was not Matawan. There were no guard towers, no high walls. This was a place for people whose families could afford discretion, whose breakdowns needed to be managed quietly, away from public view. Harry was assigned a room in the men's ward, a small space with a bed, a chair, and a window that looked out at nothing in particular. The doctors diagnosed him with dementia praecox, what would later be called schizophrenia, compounded by chronic alcoholism and what they described in their notes as constitutional psychopathic inferiority. They noted his paranoia, his inability to maintain coherent thought, his belief that he was being persecuted by unnamed enemies. They did not note that many of these symptoms had been present for decades, that Harry had spent most of his life in a state of psychological collapse, held together only by money. Now the money was nearly gone, and the collapse was complete. He was not violent at the hospital. He was passive, withdrawn, largely silent. He attended the group meals but did not eat much. He sat in the day room, staring at the walls. When doctors asked him questions, he gave answers that bore no relationship to what had been asked. He talked about Stanford White as if the murder had happened yesterday. He talked about Evelyn as if she were still his wife, still waiting for him somewhere. He talked about his mother as if she were alive, as if she might visit at any moment. The doctors took notes and adjusted his sedatives. The newspapers did not report his commitment. There was no public interest in Harry Kendall Thaw anymore. The trial had been 20 years ago. Stanford White had been dead for more than 2 decades. The people who had followed the case, who had packed the courtroom and bought the special editions, had moved on to newer scandals, fresher tragedies. Harry had become a footnote, a name that appeared occasionally in retrospective articles about the murder, always described in the past tense even though he was still alive. His family did not visit. He had 2 surviving siblings, his sister Margaret and his brother Josiah, but they had severed contact years earlier, exhausted by his arrests, his scandals, his relentless demands for money and attention. The trust continued to pay for his care at the hospital, an automatic monthly transfer managed by lawyers who had never met him. The family name was on the checks, but the family itself had moved on. Harry spent 5 years at the Pennsylvania Hospital for Mental Diseases. His condition did not improve. If anything, it worsened. His memory became unreliable. He would forget where he was, why he was there, what year it was. He would have moments of clarity where he remembered everything: the trial, the verdicts, the years in Mattawan, and then the clarity would dissolve, and he would be lost again, adrift in fragments of the past that no longer connected to anything real. In 1933, the hospital's administration contacted the trustees of Harry's estate. The monthly payments had been late, then stopped entirely. The trust that had sustained Harry for over a decade had been depleted by poor investments during the stock market crash, by ongoing legal fees, by the slow drain of institutional care. There was still some money left, but not enough to cover the hospital's fees. The trustees proposed moving Harry to a state institution, a public facility where the cost would be covered by Pennsylvania's mental health system. Harry was transferred to the Norristown State Hospital in May 1933. The facility was overcrowded, underfunded, and overwhelmed by the influx of patients produced by the Depression. Men who had lost jobs, homes, families, men who had broken under the weight of economic collapse, filled the wards alongside those who had been insane for years. Harry arrived in a hospital van, walked into the admissions building with an orderly holding his arm, and was assigned to a ward with 40 other men. The room smelled of unwashed bodies and disinfectant. The beds were close together, separated by narrow aisles. Harry was given the one near the window. He sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at the floor. He stopped speaking entirely within weeks of his arrival. The doctors noted it in his file but did not consider it unusual. Many patients at Norristown stopped speaking. There was nothing to say, and no one to say it to. Harry moved through the hospital routines in silence: meals, recreation time, mandatory walks through the hospital grounds. He obeyed instructions without resistance and without comprehension. He had become what the institution needed him to be: quiet, manageable, invisible. The final collapse of his memory occurred sometime in 1935. The doctors could not pinpoint an exact date because no one had been paying close attention. Harry began to lose recognition of faces, names, places. He no longer knew his own name when attendants asked. He did not know where he was or why he was there. He did not remember Stanford White. He did not remember Evelyn. He did not remember the trial, the verdicts, the years in Mattawan. His entire life had been erased, not by death, but by the slow dissolution of the mind that had held it. He wandered the hospital grounds on supervised walks, an old man in rumpled institutional clothing, shuffling along the paths without purpose or destination. Other patients ignored him. The staff forgot his name and referred to him by his bed number. He had no visitors. He received no mail. He existed in a kind of temporal void, alive but not living, present but not remembered. In 1938, a journalist researching a book about famous American trials discovered that Harry Kendall Thaw was still alive, committed to a state hospital in Pennsylvania. The journalist contacted the hospital administration, requesting an interview. The hospital refused. Harry was not competent to consent, they explained, and his family had forbidden any contact with the press. The journalist published the book without the interview. Harry was mentioned in 2 paragraphs. Harry Kendall Thaw did not die quickly. He lingered at Norristown State Hospital for another 9 years after his memory collapsed. A body without biography, alive in the technical sense, but absent in every way that mattered. He was 67 years old in 1938, and his body had begun the slow process of shutting down, organs failing incrementally, systems breaking, the machinery of life grinding to a halt without drama or urgency. He developed bed sores in 1939. The hospital was understaffed, the wards overcrowded, and patients who could not move themselves were left in the same positions for hours. The sores became infected. The infection spread. Harry was moved to the hospital's medical ward, treated with sulfa drugs, and returned to his bed when the infection cleared. The sores returned within weeks. The cycle repeated. The doctors noted it in his chart with clinical detachment: patient unresponsive, patient non-ambulatory. Patient requires total care. His weight dropped steadily. He had never been a large man, but by 1940 he weighed less than 100 pounds. The hospital meals were institutional, bland, starchy, designed for volume rather than nutrition. Harry ate what was put in front of him mechanically, without taste or preference. Sometimes he forgot to swallow, and orderlies would find food still in his mouth hours after a meal. They would remove it, wipe his face, and mark it in the logbook. Feeding assistance required. He stopped walking in 1941. His legs had atrophied from disuse, muscles wasting until they could no longer support his weight. He was confined to a wheelchair, pushed to the day room each morning by an orderly who did not know his name and did not care to learn it. Harry would sit in the wheelchair for hours, staring at the wall or at nothing, his hands folded in his lap, his mouth slightly open. Other patients moved around him, some talking to themselves, some playing cards, some pacing endless circles around the room. Harry did not move. He was a piece of furniture, something to be navigated around. The Second World War began, and the hospital's resources stretched thinner. Staff left to join the military or to work in defense factories where the pay was better. The remaining orderlies and nurses worked double shifts, managing wards with twice the number of patients and half the number of hands. Harry's care became even more minimal. He was bathed once a week, if someone remembered. His bedding was changed when it became unsanitary enough to notice. He received his medications irregularly. None of it made any difference to him. He did not complain. He did not react. He simply existed. In 1942, the hospital administration sent a routine letter to the trustees of Harry's estate, informing them that the patient's condition had deteriorated significantly and that the family might wish to make arrangements. The letter was formal, perfunctory. The trustees did not respond. Harry's siblings were still alive, Margaret in Pittsburgh, Josiah in New York, but they had long since stopped acknowledging his existence. When Margaret was asked about her brother by an acquaintance in 1943, she said simply that Harry had died years ago. It was not technically true, but it was not technically false either. Harry developed pneumonia in the winter of 1944. It was the third time in 5 years. His lungs, weakened by decades of smoking and drinking, could not clear the infection. He was treated with penicillin, one of the new miracle drugs that had become available during the war. The infection cleared, but Harry's breathing never fully recovered. He developed a wet, rattling cough that persisted through the spring and summer. The doctors noted it, but did not treat it. There was nothing to treat. His body was simply wearing out. He stopped eating solid food in 1945. The hospital put him on a liquid diet. Broths, milk, water thickened with gelatin. An orderly would hold a cup to Harry's lips and tilt it slowly, waiting for him to swallow. Sometimes he did. Sometimes the liquid would run down his chin and onto his gown. The orderly would wipe it away and try again. The process took an hour for each meal. Harry's weight dropped below 90 pounds. The war ended in August 1945. The hospital staff celebrated, gathering in the day room to listen to the radio announcements. Patients who were coherent enough to understand joined in. Harry sat in his wheelchair near the window, oblivious. The world had fought a global war. Millions had died. Entire cities had been destroyed. And Harry Kendall Thaw had noticed none of it. He had not read a newspaper in a decade. He had not spoken a word in 12 years. History had moved on without him. In 1946, Harry was moved to the hospital's chronic care ward, a section reserved for patients who were not expected to recover, who required round-the-clock nursing, who were simply waiting to die. The ward was quieter than the others, the patients mostly bedridden, the staff trained in palliative rather than curative care. Harry was placed in a bed near the nurses' station so they could monitor him more easily. He lay on his side, his body curled into a fetal position, his eyes open but unseeing. He developed pressure ulcers again, this time more severe. The wounds would not heal. His circulation was too poor, his body too depleted. The nurses cleaned and dressed the wounds daily, but infection set in regardless. The infection became systemic. Harry developed a fever that lasted for weeks. His breathing became labored, each breath a visible effort. The doctors did not intervene aggressively. There was no point. They kept him comfortable, administered morphine for pain, and waited. Harry Kendall Thaw died on February 22, 1947, at 3:17 in the morning. A night nurse found him during her rounds, his body still, his eyes closed finally. She checked for a pulse, found none, and noted the time in the logbook. She covered his body with a sheet and called the attending physician, who arrived 20 minutes later, confirmed the death, and signed the certificate. Cause of death: bronchopneumonia, secondary to general debility. He was 75 years old. He had been institutionalized in one form or another for 34 of those years. The hospital administration contacted the trustees of Harry's estate. There was no money left for a funeral. The trust had been depleted years earlier. The trustees contacted Harry's family. Margaret agreed reluctantly to pay for a burial. There would be no service, she said, no announcement. The burial would be private, immediate, and unmarked. Harry's body was taken to Allegheny Cemetery in Pittsburgh 3 days after his death and buried in the Thaw family plot. No one attended. The gravediggers lowered the plain casket into the ground and filled the grave while a light snow began to fall. There was no headstone, no marker, nothing to indicate who lay there. The Thaw family plot in Allegheny Cemetery occupied a prominent position on a hillside overlooking Pittsburgh. William Thaw, the patriarch who had built the fortune, was buried there beneath a granite monument 20 feet tall, carved with his name and dates, surrounded by an iron fence that marked the boundaries of family territory. His wife, Mary Copley Thaw, lay beside him under a smaller but equally substantial stone. Their children were meant to join them eventually, arranged in careful rows that would demonstrate in death what they had been in life. A dynasty, a legacy, a name that mattered. Harry's grave had no stone. The plot had been opened, the casket lowered, the earth replaced, but no marker was ever commissioned. Margaret had paid for the burial itself, the transportation of the body from Norristown, the opening of the ground, the basic casket, but she refused to pay for anything permanent. She told the cemetery administration that the family would arrange for a stone later. Later never came. The grave remained unmarked, a depression in the earth that gradually filled in and flattened until there was no visible evidence anyone had been buried there at all. The newspapers did not report Harry's death immediately. The hospital had not notified the press, and the family had no reason to. It was only when a clerk at the cemetery, processing routine paperwork, mentioned the burial to a reporter friend that the information became public. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette ran a brief obituary on March 2, 1947, 8 days after Harry's death. The notice was 3 paragraphs long, buried on page 17 between advertisements for household goods and employment notices. Harry Kendall Thaw, 75, whose murder of architect Stanford White in 1906 was one of the most sensational trials of the century, died February 22nd at Norristown State Hospital. Mr. Thaw had been institutionalized for mental illness for many years. He was buried privately in Allegheny Cemetery. He is survived by a sister, Margaret Thaw McCaleb, and a brother, Josiah Thaw, both of Pittsburgh. The New York Times ran a longer obituary, but not much longer. 4 paragraphs, a brief summary of the murder and trials, a mention of Evelyn Nesbit, and a note that Thaw had spent the latter part of his life in mental institutions. The obituary was factual, distant, written in the tone reserved for people whose fame had curdled into notoriety decades earlier. There was no attempt to assess his life, to draw conclusions, to make meaning from what had happened. The article simply recorded that Harry Kendall Thaw had existed, had done something notable, and had now stopped existing. Evelyn Nesbit read about Harry's death in a newspaper while living in Los Angeles. She was 62 years old, working as a consultant for a sculptor who was creating pieces about the Gilded Age. Her life since leaving Harry had been difficult, marked by failed marriages, financial instability, and the long shadow of being famous for something she had not chosen. She had tried to build a career in silent films, in vaudeville, in anything that would allow her to be known for something other than the trial. Nothing had worked. She was always Evelyn Nesbit from the Harry Thaw trial, always the girl in the white dress, always the victim or the temptress, depending on who was telling the story. She read the obituary twice, then set the newspaper aside and continued with her day. She did not attend any memorial service because there was none. She did not send condolences to Harry's family because they had never acknowledged her as part of it. She felt nothing about his death, not relief, not sadness, not vindication. Harry had stopped being real to her decades ago, had become a character in a story people told about someone else. The news that he was dead changed nothing. He had been dead to her since 1910. The Thaw family did not hold a funeral service. Margaret McCaleb told relatives that Harry had been ill for so long, had been gone from their lives for so many years, that a service felt unnecessary and false. The truth, understood by everyone but never stated, was that the family was ashamed. Harry had been an embarrassment when he was alive, and his death was simply the final chapter of that embarrassment. They wanted him forgotten. They wanted the name Thaw to mean Williams' railroads and coal mines, not Harry's murder and madness. The estate Harry left behind was negligible. The trust established by his mother had been exhausted years earlier. His personal possessions, inventoried by the hospital after his death, consisted of 3 sets of institutional clothing, a pair of worn slippers, a wooden comb, and a small metal box containing photographs so faded they were no longer identifiable. There were no letters, no journals, no personal effects of value. Everything Harry had owned, everything he had accumulated over 75 years, fit into a single cardboard box that was given to his sister. She did not open it. She had it burned. The Thaw family fortune, the $40 million William Thaw had left in 1889, had been divided and subdivided among descendants and trusts and legal settlements until it bore no resemblance to its original form. Some branches of the family still had wealth, still lived comfortably, still carried the name with a measure of pride. But the fortune itself, the industrial empire built on coal and railroads, had been sold off, merged with other companies, absorbed into larger entities until the Thaw name appeared only in historical footnotes about Pittsburgh's industrial development. Margaret McCaleb died in 1952, 5 years after Harry. Her will made no mention of him. Josiah Thaw died in 1955. His obituary listed his accomplishments in business and philanthropy and mentioned his siblings by name, except Harry, who was referred to only as a brother who predeceased him. The effort to erase Harry from family history was deliberate and largely successful. By the 1960s, when historians and journalists would occasionally revisit the Stanford White murder, they would struggle to find information about what had happened to Harry after the trials. Records were sealed, family members refused interviews. The institutional records from Norristown State Hospital were vague and incomplete. Stanford White's architectural legacy endured. His buildings stood throughout New York, mansions, clubs, monuments. Pennsylvania Station, which he had designed, was demolished in 1963, sparking the historic preservation movement in America. Ironically, White's most famous creation was destroyed, but his name remained synonymous with architectural brilliance and the grandeur of the Gilded Age. Books were written about him. Exhibitions celebrated his work. He was remembered not for how he died, but for what he had built. Harry Kendall Thaw's legacy was different. He built nothing. He created nothing. He contributed nothing to the world except violence and spectacle. The fortune he inherited was meant to fund a life of significance, of achievement, of something that would justify the wealth and the privilege. Instead, it funded decades of destruction. Destruction of others, destruction of himself, destruction of any possibility that his life might mean something beyond what he had taken away. The grave in Allegheny Cemetery remains unmarked. Visitors to the Thaw family plot walk past the depression in the earth without knowing Harry Kendall Thaw is buried there. William Thaw's granite monument still rises above the hillside. Mary Copley Thaw's stone stands beside it. Their other children have markers with dates and names. Harry's section of ground has nothing. The grass grows over it. The cemetery records indicate the location, but there is no stone, no inscription, no evidence that anyone thought his name worth preserving. The trial appears occasionally in books about American legal history, about wealth and justice, about the Gilded Age. The story is always reduced to its simplest elements. Millionaire murders architect, claims insanity, spends decades in institutions, dies forgotten. The details shift depending on who tells it. Some emphasize Evelyn's testimony, others the legal maneuvering. A few examine Stanford White's behavior that went unquestioned until a rich man's violence made it unavoidable. But no account makes sense of what Harry actually was. The facts are clear. Extraordinary wealth, every advantage, complete freedom from consequence. He used all of it to destroy himself and anyone near him. The question that remains unanswered is whether the wealth caused the destruction or simply enabled what was already there. Whether Harry would have been violent and obsessive without money, or whether the money itself, the endless insulation from reality, the removal of every natural boundary, created the conditions for his collapse. Evelyn Nesbit outlived him by 30 years. She gave interviews in her later life, spoke about the trial with exhaustion rather than drama. When asked if Harry had been insane, she said only that he had been wealthy, and that was worse. The fortune William Thaw built is gone, divided and dissolved and absorbed into other entities, until the name appears only in historical footnotes. The wealth that seemed permanent turned out to be temporary. It could not save Harry. It could not buy him sanity, love, or purpose. In the end, it could not even purchase a headstone. What remains is simpler and more unsettling. A man who had everything, built nothing, and left behind only an unmarked grave and a question no one can answer.